Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special edition of the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. This is Marcus Cribb, the manager at Apsley House. I'm Josh, I run this channel, and that's about it. And today we are talking all things Wellington.
Absolutely. Wellington and Waterloo, I think we're going to cover.
Specifically, yes.
The start of the 100 Days.
Specifically the start of the 100 Days, the 1815 campaign, because there's some pretty important dates coming up.
Yes, we're in the middle of it right now, counting down to Waterloo. Really.
What date? Where are we at historically?
Napoleon would be so we're in mid March as we're recording this. Napoleon would be in Paris, and Wellington's left the Congress of Vienna. I think he's heading back across Europe, and Napoleon's trying to overrule his parliament, I believe, at the moment, from what I was reading today.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't all quite agree with him, and there's still some royalist factions within the parliament, and so they weren't totally agreeing with his usurper status, let's say.
Yes, indeed. That's actually a thing that has come up since the bicentenary a lot. Actually, is how before the bicentenary in 2015, you had all this talk about how all the French wanted Napoleon back, and they were desperate to overthrow the Bourbons again. But actually, very respected people like Charles Esdale and Michael Glover have
Adam Ziminski.
Have all argued fairly convincingly, I think, that they didn't want Napoleon, although they obviously were unhappy as well with the Bourbons as well.
There's definitely two sides to it, and I think it's too easy today that some of the real Napoleon-file historians would just say he came back and it was a blaze of eagles and glory. But there's certainly areas of France, especially in the northwest, that remain fiercely royalist to the Bourbon family throughout, and actually there were insurrections through quite a lot of Napoleon's time. He was having to send troops in to quell riots because they always asked for troops back, and quite a few actually fled over to Britain, and they formed some emigre loyalist regiments to actually fight against Napoleon. So there were occasionally some French versus French people, like the Chasseurs Britanniques, who are a fascinating regiment to read about.
So Napoleon's on his way to France and through France, and Wellington is somewhere in Europe heading towards Belgium at the second.
Yes, that's Belgium, not France. Should we rewind this a little bit to 1814?
Yes, why not?
So we've just had about over 10 years of constant warfare, all the way through. We've had a campaign all the way down from Egypt to Moscow to Copenhagen. But focusing for us, we've got Wellington initially, briefly replaced by Sir John Moore, and then Wellington again for about 8 years, continuously in Portugal and Spain, pushing his way all the way up into the Pyrenees. Now, Napoleon and Wellington never actually quite came ahead because Wellington had to be sent home for an inquiry. And poor Sir John Moore, much lament about, was killed, and he kind of faced Napoleon's full brunt. And then it was the Spanish also there leading his forces, most notoriously the horrible guerrilla warfare that went on, with terrible atrocities taking place on both sides. But the Spanish today still call it their war of liberation because they had been occupied. So it's quite difficult to tell because of some horrible things that went on, castration and crucifixions and in the mountains. But they definitely felt like they were trying to fight to liberate their country from an army that had just supplanted itself in overnight and had put their king under house arrest and put Napoleon's older brother Joseph on the throne, which they were slightly less than happy about.
Yeah, he had a habit of doing that, didn't he?
Yes.
Foisting his relatives on different thrones.
He's quite happy relatives who were not as good at the bureaucracy as Napoleon himself.
And even Napoleon wasn't exactly the best statesman in the world, so it's saying something if you think about it.
and then especially Joseph, who just was not fantastic at his job. But so that's going on, whilst Napoleon's really concentrating on East Europe in the famous invasion of Russia and summer of 1812. And slowly all of his armies that were currently his allies, like the Prussians, all these different coalitions form and change, and they start to turn against him one by one. Even you've even got Sweden, where the King of Sweden by
Bernadotte.
Bernadotte, one of his own marshals.
Yes, he was a traitor and things like that. His life is actually quite fascinating, and his descendants are the kings and queens of
Still the Queen of Sweden today. And I'd say he wasn't a traitor. He was given a job opportunity, a promotion, and he swore allegiance to Sweden.
He did. Napoleon would have done exactly the same thing.
He would have done the same. I think Napoleon asked him to say, "Oh, will you never fight against me?" And he said, "No, I'm Swedish now." So,
which is actually a fairly honourable thing to do.
I think he was quite. I think he just kind of took the opportunity with both hands and became the King of Sweden.
And as a result, the most successful of his marshals.
Which leads you to Leipzig, where the Swedish were there. There was a couple of Brits there. The
rocket troop.
Artillery were there. It's a rocket troop brigade.
Devil's Own artillery.
So some Congress rockets. And then Napoleon, luckily, falls the first time. He abdicates in favour of his son, but nobody accepts that. And there are some terrible decisions made. And actually, the British Foreign Ministry didn't sign the first treaty because of Fontainebleau, because basically they decided that they were going to give him a kingdom. They're going to give him Elba. They were going to give him an army. And everybody was saying it was too close to France. It was too close to Italy. He's got allies in both. And the British Foreign Ministry, as it was trying to argue to send him further away, which obviously we did eventually. But at the time, they thought it would be honourable to give him a nice bit of the Mediterranean. And what a mistake that was.
It seemed like a good idea at the time, and it's very in keeping with the way foreign policy acted at that time, wherein you don't necessarily throw him in a dungeon somewhere. You try and give him some incentive to go along with it. He was not an inconsequential figure by this time, by any means. Whether or not you agreed to his legitimacy or not, you couldn't ignore that Napoleon had been a force politically through Europe for over 10 years.
Because Britain recognised his legitimacy in all this time.
Yeah.
So because we're still looking after the Bourbon family, basically.
Yeah,
so.
It was impossible after a certain point to have said we can accept you as king because we have to still have diplomatic ties to the ancien regime. Yes. So.
And we're protecting our friends Portugal, which we've been friends with since about 1300.
Exactly.
So they've just been they were a neutral country, just been invaded, and so we got to look after our friends as well. A slight bias there, but definitely have to.
It made sense, I guess, to give him this little what seemed like a paltry offering to keep him entertained, to give him a little bit of credibility, to live out his life in a certain amount of.
Little island of Elba, which is right by Corsica, where Napoleon was born. So it's a nice little nod, and he was sent there with what's kind of he's called the governor of the island, but it was actually kind of his jailer who went with him, and they've given him some imperial guards and Polish lancers, famously, and I believe a couple of brigs.
The famous one. The one which he would use to escape from Elba, while Sir Neil Campbell was basically having a joyride to Italy, as he tended to do. Yes. Is, I think, called the Inconstant.
This was the French brig Inconstant. He'd come back on. Napoleon had his couple of months away, and he tried to build some roads and reform the healthcare and the education system on Elba. And he then managed to call in his brigs, and as I understand it, they repainted and slightly deceived the Royal Navy and Royalist French blockade. And Sir Neil Campbell had gone off to see his mistress and said, you promised to behave, don't you? Okay, brilliant. Well done, you will behave. And as he went in, he got his troops onto these ships that he'd been secretly kind of repainting to look a bit more like British brigs and frigates, and he slipped off onto the South French coast. I think he was at sea for about 3 days. There wasn't much wind, and he lands on the south coast of France.
Yes, because he was actually trapped in the main port of Elba, which, what is it called? Is it Porto Ferraro or something like that?
Yeah, pronunciation is the
And it was
French place.
a really dank, sort of misty day with no wind, and they were all lined up on the dock, and they didn't know whether Sir Neil was going to be coming back sooner than they thought or not. And one of the famous bits is that he lines up the guard and inspects them while he waits for the wind to change.
Which is now the beautiful paintings of those
Yeah,
scenes.
really nice paintings.
It's quite a romanticised scene. There's one that's by Joseph Boehm as well, of him departing and all the troops kind of coming with him on the little boat, the rowboats to get onto the ship.
And there's also another story about him when they get to sea. They almost immediately run smack into a French royalist patrol ship.
That's like the Zephyr.
Yeah, the Zephyr. And he has the guard come up and lie down on the decks in case they have to fight, which if it really came to it, I'm not sure he would have actually wanted to go down on a ship in a sea battle. But he supposedly had them ready, and there's an exchange between the two captains. He said, "How's the great man today?" And the captain of the Inconstant said, "He's doing very well, thank you." And they just pass each other, and the invasion of France has begun, essentially.
It has. It's yeah, you're right. It is another invasion because Louis XVIII, who's unfortunately quite unwell, quite ineffective and obese monarch, but he's back. He's taken nearly all of Napoleon's marshals, and they've sworn a new oath of loyalty. Not all, but majority of actually have sworn this oath, which leads certain people like Ney to a very sticky end. And he looks around this room and he hears that Napoleon's returned. And the famous quote is, Ney, is red hair, the bravest of the brave, steps forwards and promises that he will bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, which he completely is lying about, really.
It seems that way.
I don't think he had any intention.
Well, yeah, I like to give him. I'll give him a break. I'll say he meant it at the time, because Ney was a tough guy, and I know that people who have read about Ney say that he was probably suffering quite badly from his service in Russia, and probably by today would have been diagnosed with PTSD.
Quite like Picton.
Yeah,
general in that
and he. I don't know. I don't actually know what Ney's feelings were towards Napoleon at this point, because as we were just saying before, not everybody wanted Napoleon back. They wanted someone different than Louis XVIII, like one of his sons or his brother would have been more acceptable, I think.
It's not perfect,
but yeah. So I'll say that Ney meant it at the time.
Okay. But he certainly promised it.
He certainly promised it, and that was a big deal back then. So,
and in a room with lots of witnesses in front of the king, and he took an army down there, and Napoleon's coming across individual regiments one at a time, who pretty much one by one turn coat literally and join him. I think there's in the famous Waterloo 1970 film, you have it actually as Ney, but Ney turns up a little bit later. Yeah. I'm your emperor. If you want to shoot me, here I am. And they had no intention. They just came across. And so by the time Ney arrived, Napoleon's army is already swelling. And so he's able to enter France with pretty much not a shot fired. It's now marked by the route of eagles up from the south coast of France near Grenoble, and up slowly, snaking its way through Paris. And as he's reaching Paris, Louis XVIII basically gets in his carriage and runs. In fact, I've got a good quote here, and this is one newspaper, but it's basically their tagline as the tone changes. So this is in March 1815. The tiger has left his den. The ogre has been 3 days at sea. The wretch has landed at Fréjus. The buzzard has reached the coast. The invader has arrived at Grenoble. The tyrant has entered Lyon. The usurper has been glimpsed 50 miles from Paris. Tomorrow, Napoleon will be at our gates. So the next one after he's in, the emperor will proceed to the Tuileries tomorrow. And then last, His Imperial Majesty will address his loyal subjects. The tone there, from tiger, ogre, wretch, buzzard,
Yeah.
usurper, to His Imperial Majesty.
It should be some sort of parody movie where there should be some montage of that editor.
Furiously writing.
Yeah.
And I think in the last scene, he's pretty much got a musket against the side of his head.
Yes, it's sort of like the editorial, I don't know, incarnation of a face sort of falling.
Meanwhile, most of the rest of Europe, including Talleyrand, the foreign minister for Napoleon, is still the foreign minister for France. They're off in Vienna at the famous Congress, trying to write the landscape and the political map of the era.
Yeah. And
Wellington, who will obviously come on to, he's actually over there as one of the major representatives.
He is, and I was reading, I was having a look at Christopher Hibbett's book about Wellington to actually look at some things about him in Vienna, because actually I think that along with some of his other diplomatic work, he's not famous as a diplomatist, Wellington, but he did quite a lot of it.
It's not one of his strengths to jump ahead. He later becomes prime minister twice, and he said there's a little quote about his first cabinet meeting I found very strange. I gave them their orders, and then they asked me questions. And this is just absolutely not how Wellington does things. So he's got all of the heads of state or their representatives there, and he can no longer give orders to them, because there's going to be all sorts of little questions about the Prussian-Danish border that need answering.
Because he apparently went up to Metternich, and he basically said that he wanted to go straight forward without stratagems or subterfuge, which says quite a lot about the Duke of Wellington, that he really couldn't be bothered with any wheeling and dealing, and I'd really just like to get this job done, please.
Which probably wasn't how everyone else was going to do things.
No, I don't think so.
You can't say that. I mean, as much as we're both kind of taking the Allies' side here, you can't say they don't have agendas. They don't have things they want to get out of it, and they also have some dealings that are going to end up badly for certain people, especially the Poles come to mind. They always get a rough deal of.
Indeed, the Polish, obviously, great supporters of Napoleon because they had a better deal with him. Just as simple as that. But on the other hand, then you have, interestingly, the Prussians, who feel that they have been elbowed out of the Congress of Vienna. Because
Russia's starting to look to expand. We're before united Germany, but under Napoleon, you've got the Confederation of the Rhine, which, when you overlay it with modern Germany...
Yes, they wanted a lot of that.
They wanted a lot of that.
But the Russians and the Austrians weren't going to stand for it.
The Tsar and the Russians are really leading the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And there's a great moment actually there. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know how to confirm it either. But once everybody finds out that Napoleon's loose, and they really quickly all decide we'd better get the armies called up, boys. And there's a brief moment where they want to basically declare him an outright criminal so that anybody can shoot him if they want to. And Wellington actually opposes that. But he's leaving to go to Brussels, and apparently Tsar Alexander stops him and fixes him with a steely glare and says, "It is up to you to save the world again."
Brilliant quote. He really does. He has to save the world, or at least the Western European world as they were currently looking at it. And I kind of strongly believe that he did. Without that, I mean, without Waterloo, arguably the Allies would have all eventually turned in and marched, and Napoleon, I don't really think he ever stood much of a chance. But if Napoleon had continued in 1813, the world would be a different place, and I will leave it to other people to argue if it would be a better place.
But what's interesting is that one of the reasons that Wellington didn't go to America, because the Prince Regent was rather keen on him going over there, because obviously the war in America was winding down, and they wanted it's all about deals. By the time of 1814, they wanted a good deal, and if Wellington's in America with the ability to make peace, then they would get a pretty good deal. And one of the reasons he didn't go to America was because he was afraid of something happening in Europe when he wasn't there. And he wrote to the government saying that I'm the only one that you will and our allies will have confidence in if something goes awry, basically in Vienna. Obviously, it went awry in Paris.
That's why in Paris. And this is when you're saying about the Tsar and they wanted to declare him outlaw. This is when they basically declare war on Napoleon.
Not France.
Declare war on a man, whether you're his biggest fan like Andrew Roberts or his fiercest opponent like Charles Esdale, and you view him as a scourge of Europe. A brilliant quote I saw earlier, Esdale writing, and I lean strongly in that camp. But they declare war on Napoleon, and that just boosts his ego because then everyone's telling him, "But you are greater than France. You embody France. You are France." And it's not really much coming back from that. Writing's on the wall for the war, and all these countries sign up to raise armies of hundreds of thousands. Britain turns around and says, "We just don't have a population to do that."
So as usual,
we just don't have the population. We don't want to go into conscription. That's something we've actually seen done. Napoleon introduces conscription, and it's hugely unpopular. We have a ballot system for the militia, which is like the home service full time, and that's unpopular and leads to some rioting actually. So we don't want to go down that route. So we say we're going to provide our army. We'll recall our troops, but we'll fund you. What we do have is deep pockets.
And interestingly, what Napoleon doesn't do when he comes back in 1815 is general conscription. And some people say that was a great mistake because it missed the ability to mobilize the nation.
I think he was quite torn on it because he needed to get his huge armies. He was never going to get to the Grand Army again, but he wanted his Army du Nord up to be huge numbers very quickly. And I think he basically calls up their version of the militia and the Home Guard as basically where they've got a mixture of frontline troops, reserves and militia all in one, and he basically starts mobilising them through. I did see some quite interesting debate recently between a historian who's a real Napoleon fan, but even he was saying that actually that was a mistake because what he was then having was just not enough time to train his troops. And the army in 1815 was just never going to be the army it should have been in 1812. And it was just playing into the Allies' hands that they were under strength but also undertrained.
It could definitely be the case because it had to be organised really very quickly. He had a matter of months to get a fighting force ready because he banged on about, I didn't want this war. All the Allies are making war on me, which was pretty much his battle cry for his entire career. But at the same time, he downright knew that him coming back would mean war.
There was no way he could have thought there was going to be any other situation. He does have some very well-trained elite troops, which Wellington doesn't have as many of because we've just shipped so many of them off to Canada.
It's an interesting, almost parity of situations, really. You had Napoleon scrambling to get troops from anywhere he could. He calls up classes of volunteers quickly. He mobilizes the National Guard and the he to mount his cavalry, which is a huge problem to mount the cavalry. He
had problems with his cavalry since Russia. I was reading somewhere that after the Russian campaign, he needed over 50,000 horses in a matter of months, and there wasn't that number. So they were taking farm horses and mounting them as cavalry, which just wasn't possible.
Makes sense because they lost a lot of horses in Russia. But this in 1815 he was trying to raid the king's stables for horses, and he basically commandeered all the horses of the gendarmerie. So there were some trained horses there. By the end of April still and into May, you had officers in depots and cavalry, officers in charge of the cavalry in the Ministry of War basically telling him, we don't have armour, we don't have horses, one regiment only had front breastplates, we don't have back plates for the cuirassiers. I think I've read somewhere, I think it was in the Waterloo Companion, that one regiment just didn't have cuirasses at all.
Well, the Wellington's army and the Allies have got a different problem, that we're actually marching some of our troops to demobilisation. People like the King's German Legion famously were literally marching back to Hanover.
It was stationed at Bexhill in Sussex, I think, waiting to go home.
And you've got the famous 95th Rifles that they managed to fight at the last battles of the Peninsular War up in Toulouse. And they get shipped across, and they actually end up fighting the Battle of New Orleans. And they're just coming back, and they're thinking, finally, some peace and quiet. And before they even pretty much pulling into Portsmouth, it's quickly turnabout, head into Brussels. I think that's Adams' Brigade. They've fought basically now for about 9 years without a break.
It's the 52nd and the 43rd and
yeah,
71st and things like that.
And they're massively then going to be supplemented with our allies, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who've got some really split loyalties, especially as they're basically modern day Netherlands and Belgium. And Belgium was really part of France under all of Napoleon's reign. And I'm speaking as a sweeping generic here, but they kind of prefer the French than their new Dutch king.
I think it's fair to say they were one of the little principalities that was turned into a big kind of enfranchised deal under the Napoleonic system, like the Confederation of the Rhine, because the Prussian version of that is the Saxons, but they didn't want to be Prussians. The Belgians didn't want to be Dutch.
It's one of the few wars that actually takes place between the Napoleonic and the Crimea. Is actually the Belgian Revolution. They do rise up and throw off what is currently then the Prince of Orange in 1815. You've got a real mixed match. It's one of the first times that actually we're going to have the Hanoverian army, because you've got the King's German Legion, who are largely recruited from Hanover, but are part of the British army. So you've got them alongside their cousins in the Hanoverian army, who are worse paid and are looked down upon by their countrymen. Never mind, let's list off some more countries. We've got Nassau, we've got the Brunswickers, the Black Brunswickers, the Duke of Brunswick there, who we can never not think of that they ate
dogs in the peninsula. Unforgivable.
Absolutely terrible. You can shoot at me in my regiment, but you can't eat my dog. It's just not.
It's just the rules. It's just the rules.
And that's not even counting the other German states and some of the other regiments that are smaller made up, and the fact that obviously you've got Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, and at the point, nearly all the what we'd say is the English regiment. About 25 to 30%, give or take, are Irish anyway. I was reading the 16th Light Dragoons. The colonel wanted them to become Scottish. He had Scottish roots, and so he just kept trying to send recruiting parties to Perthshire and to Edinburgh, and they were turning back with like 2 or 3 men. And then they're going to Ireland, and they're coming back with like 50, 60. And so quickly, the regiment became pretty much Irish. So you've got all of these different mixes going in. To say England, they actually meant Britain or even the United Kingdom for them. It's just the terminology, I believe.
Yeah, even Scottish generals would talk of England.
Which adds a layer of confusion onto this conglomeration of different nationalities.
It does, because you in all the books on Waterloo, it's really interesting to see the terminology that the various historians will use to try and describe Wellington's army. They're the Anglo-Allies, or they're the Allies, or sometimes they just call them the British because he's the commanding officer.
There was a quick debate about that.
It was, yes.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands wanted the Prince of Orange to be given the role of Commander-in-Chief. Thankfully, he didn't, but unfortunately, the Dutch, which is obviously the Belgians too, were providing a huge contingent of forces, and so they really did get to call some of the shots. And so in the end, he was given command of the First Corps, which was a third of Wellington's army. And way Wellington managed to see his way around this is he broke up his British divisions of especially some of his veteran regiments, and started interchanging them. So he didn't have one corps there, British, and then a different one of Dutch, and different one of Belgians, different one of Germans and Hanoverians. He mixed them all in so that his strengths and his weaknesses were balanced out. In March and April and even May, you've got a lot of just moving across Europe, armies forming up, Blucher being given command of the Prussians, and you've actually got Austrian, Russian, and even Swedish armies just starting to march into Europe. So it takes quite a lot of time.
It does. And the war has actually begun because Murat over in Naples
comes in and starts fighting his own little war, even though he's promised to everybody that he's going to remain loyal. So there's a little war over there, and ultimately has to run back to Naples.
You have in the north the Armée du Nord. You have General Rapp in the Alps. You have the only marshal to come out of Spain with distinction, Marshal Suchet, in the south of France, watching the southern Alps. And opposing him are probably 2 or 3 Austrian armies and the Italian states from Savoy.
There's another insurrection in the west from the French royalists.
The Vendée. And the Austrians are commanded largely, I think, by General Schwarzenberg, and the Russians by Barclay de Tolly, because Kutuzov is dead.
Yes.
And then we have the hot seat, which is the Low Countries, Belgium, where everybody goes to fight.
It's the crossroads of Europe, really.
It's easy for Napoleon to get to, so he can get a very quick mobilization of a lot of troops. Blucher has marched west with a sizable Prussian army, and Wellington is in Brussels with his allied army, and he's having a real headache of a time trying to organize them. And at this point, nobody is thinking Napoleon is going to attack them.
They don't expect an offensive, no. In fact, the British aristocracy and society think it's going to be a long summer. And as most of the aristocracy are in a position either in the foreign ministry, the government, or the army, a lot of them have just gone out there. So you've basically got most of what was termed at the time society has, rather than going to their second homes in Britain, has picked up and is renting houses in Brussels.
Because it's cheaper there, actually.
It's
cheaper there, and people refer to it as resembling a British spa town, and it's
a bit like Bath.
Yeah, and they've been there since the beginning of the year. Wellington's mother was still there.
They see a lot of cricket matches, a lot of gambling, a lot of liaisons between. Very famously, we're getting into things like Vanity Fair and those kind of eras.
That is where it comes from.
It's a bit like their first holiday, and they're suddenly meeting people. And
exactly, because it's been about 10 years since the piece of the little piece of Amiens, when the last time they were able to go out.
So there's a bit of liberation. They've got a bit of peace. And famously, not the Duchess of Richmond's, there are other balls.
As the summer progressed, there were activities and balls almost every night. Wilson Croker, the Whig politician, he said that the Duke of Wellington was always hosting balls himself.
He was hosting lots. So there was famously the Duchess of Richmond's ball on the eve, but there was many balls. And I always find it quite interesting in fiction that these TV dramas, they always seem to get a ticket to the Duchess of Richmond's ball.
They do, don't they?
But they never any of the other balls.
No, or the cricket matches, or the review of the entire cavalry division at Grammont.
They make cavalry reviews. You've got gambling and cards late into the night. There's a lot going on, but everyone seems to end up at the Duchess of Richmond's ball.
Of course they do, and for a very good reason, because no one would believe that this coincided the way it did, although if you actually look at society in Brussels at the time, and you look at the political situation and compare them, you'd almost actually have to admit that it is a mathematical certainty something is going to happen dramatically with the two.
The storm clouds are gathering.
And it just so happened that it coincided that the Duchess of Richmond, who wanted to throw a private ball, happened to, I think at the beginning of June, ask the Duke of Wellington, could I give a ball? And he said, you may give your ball in absolute security. The invitations were sent out on the 13th of June.
And there was, at that point, no likelihood. But actually, Napoleon had pretty much written his orders by that point. Confusingly, it's worth noting, he'd written 2 sets of orders. And for his about like 6 corps. And the problem was that actually the order of march was different in these 2 different orders. And there's quite a lot of debate about whether they were purposely trying to deceive the Allies, or whether one of his staff got confused, or whether Napoleon got confused. So there's a bit of debate there. But they're over the border, and this is bringing us up to the 15th of June.
Indeed. I think it's a good idea to mention, since you talked about Napoleon's plans, sort of what they were, and the fact that one of the big things about the Waterloo campaign is Napoleon's staff. It's one of the most contested kind of debates in the entire subject, and that is, was Napoleon off his game? Was he let down by his staff? Was he betrayed by his staff?
This is the beginning of the what ifs.
Exactly.
Of 100 different points. If one had changed,
exactly.
would the battle change? But before it even started, what if certain characters were there who were there in Russia and in Prussia?
What we have
and they
here,
weren't there now.
No, what we have here is Marshal Soult in the position of Chief of Staff, and people find that absurd when they compare Soult to Berthier, who mysteriously died shortly before.
Fell out of a window?
Yes, fell, pushed
out
jumped.
a window.
One of these three, he landed on a pavement and died. That is what we know about the death of his trusted aide Berthier, who is said to be the only man who was able to coherently understand the babble that came out of Napoleon's mouth and put it into coherent military language.
Right. He's obviously not got Murat, his dashing cavalry commander. He went in too early, and if he'd waited a bit longer, the Austrians might have been distracted. But so he's not got his cavalry commander.
No, and he has left what many people believe to be his finest field commanders in Paris and in other positions around France, and that of course means the Iron Marshal Davout. And although they weren't really interested, I think these are the sorts of generals that weren't interested in fighting for Napoleon, and I'm talking about Masséna and Marmont, who were also incredibly capable officers, but just really drop below the radar when he comes back in 1815. But Davout is in charge of Paris, and so what he has on the frontier is to be fair, quite open to the debate that surrounds it.
It's open to debate. I always wonder if he kept Davout back. He was being cautious and he expects this campaign not to succeed, but that doesn't seem like Napoleon's style. He was very much a maneuverist.
I absolutely believe that Napoleon thought he could pull this off. And to be honest, up until just before the kickoff, it was looking fairly good for him. You know, he had actually pulled off a fairly impressive...
Napoleon in his prime, about 1810, 1809, it probably could have. But by this point, he's really unwell.
Yeah, that's another factor.
He's not got his elites around him. He's very unwell. It's impossible to completely diagnose, but it's somewhere along it's got stomach problems like stomach ulcers and piles and hemorrhoids. He's not a very well man.
Not at all.
Consider that he is 6 months to the side of Wellington, and Wellington's really now actually in his prime. The two men comparable in age and talents, but he's really quite uncomfortable and in pain for a lot of the...
He's not in good shape, Napoleon's not in good shape. And his army, as we've said, is impressive in the fact it's there, but is sort of riddled with administrative and morale issues. And this is the weapon he's about to fling at Brussels. Plan being, the famous plan being, to try and get between the two and knock one completely out of the war. I think he thought he could do it.
I think he probably thought he could do it. He knew the dispositions of the Allied army. He had enough turncoats and intelligence and scouts. He had lots of cavalry all over the countryside. He knew where Blucher's coming in. He knew he's got time before the Austrians and the other German states kind of come up. He knows that the Allied Wellington army is stretched out along the border, and Wellington's really afraid now of being cut off from the coast, because it would be his means of retreat, but actually I think his biggest fear is resupply as well.
Absolutely.
So he's keeping really stretched out and keeping quite a force out in the west, and so he's not got his concentration. He's got 3 routes that he really thinks that Napoleon can come up, and he thinks actually it'd be much more sweeping left manoeuvre, and so then he'll get pushed in with Blucher. and that's not going to happen. And there's this famous Charleroi Road up past like Mons, and that's a direct line to Brussels. When you look at it on a map, there's some beautiful 1815 maps out there that you can see it's a really direct line, and you can see why he took it. And that takes you through Quatre-Bras, and it takes you straight up to Brussels.
So that's sort of Napoleon's situation, and that's sort of his plan. And the great thing about talking about Waterloo is you could take every single thing we've just talked about and do an entire conversation about that.
And I think you could do an entire one, and each single one, if you change them, would Napoleon
exactly. But
it's very difficult to tell.
If we go back to Wellington, his issues are strategically what you just said. He doesn't know what Napoleon's doing. He has fairly good information. He knows that Napoleon is actually moving towards the border. He knows that much. But the Allies...
The details and the kind of dispositions that he would like to know, that he would have got in the peninsula where he had his exploring officers, these really bold men who rode ahead behind enemy lines in their own uniforms, famously Colquhoun Grant. He needed those men out there, but one of the reasons that it makes complete sense seeing it now, but he couldn't have these men as out there in patrols of cavalry crossing the border because we've not declared war on France. They're our allies. So he can't go invading them at the moment.
He's also waiting for the rest of the Allies to line up so they can all hit France at the same time.
The longer he waits, the closer the other Allies get there. Every weekday spent waiting, troops are marching. These famous black flags of Prussia, I can see it envisioning coming across with Blucher, but also the heavy stomp of Russia behind them.
Absolutely.
The longer we wait,
the better and easier it's going to be.
Wellington's not in this for glory. He's already been given all the titles. He's already been given his dukedom. Yeah. He's out there. He's actually enjoying himself to a degree, but he's pulling his hair out at the logistical nightmare of like a tripartite army before.
It isn't his peninsular army. He has to start from scratch with it. And a lot of people think with like 19th century armies, you have your army and it goes to war. It's actually the composition, the officers, the way it's supplied, the way it moves, and basically just the confidence you as the commanding officer have in the orders you give to your officers, trusting that they will do exactly what you think they're going to do.
Well, that's Wellington's biggest headache, I think, because certain generals would say vaguely, I want you to go west, I want you to go south, and these are my orders, and you do that. Well, this is obviously in an era before any sort of signals. It's a written letter with normally a young aristocrat. And Wellington is not one for vague orders. He is a micromanager. I mean, when he arrives on the 17th of June into Mont Saint-Jean, he's writing which units are going to stable their cavalry in different orchards. He's telling individual regiments and brigades, which is really not what most kind of army generals would do. I say army because you've got your brigade, your division, your corps, and then your army group traditionally. So he should be looking at corps and division level, but he's going right down onto individual levels, especially during the battle later on. So him saying, I want you to go in this area, he means specifically where he wants them to go.
And this is also why he's not doing a lot concentration-wise, because he needs the information to be able to act. And because Wellington would only usually act when he knew for absolutely certain that this was a actionable operation, essentially. He wasn't going to go at vagaries, run at this or that, or anything like that. It had to be firmly, the enemy is here. And if he
concentrated too early, then Napoleon either could have swept him to one side and sea, or could have just got right between him and Blucher.
Yes.
I think leads us to the famous Duchess of Richmond Ball.